Well, good evening, everybody. It's an enormous privilege to be with you this week. My name's Andy, and I gave my life to Jesus when I was 16 years old, and I've been growing in awe and wonder at him ever since. I have spent 37 years in pastoral ministry in 3 local churches, and 15 months ago, my wife and I stepped out of that, and now we run a ministry for Christian leaders called Jubilee Leadership. And it is just a joy to be with you for this week. The poignancy of Holy Week is something that grips us all, isn't it? The death, the suffering, the brutality, the enormous courage that Jesus demonstrated on our behalf. And so I'm not going to, I would assure you I'm a very funny man normally, but this week there will be a deliberate poignancy and reflection as we think about all that led to the cross. What I'm going to do this week, and I've called it the last week, is to take the Gospel of Mark's account of the last week of Jesus and follow those events sequentially. We're not going to do all of them, there's too many, but each night we're going to look at something that Mark's Gospel tells us happened on that particular day. And this evening we're going to be looking at the cleansing of the temple. But I don't know if you've ever noticed this before, but Mark's the only Gospel that really carefully delineates what happened on each day of the final week of Jesus. I wonder if we can go to the next slide. We can go to that. Oh, great. So this is my nephew's son, Thomas. Thomas is 5 years old, and he has become very famous on the family WhatsApp this week because he came home and told his parents completely, confidently, and with great authority that he had learnt about Easter at school this week. And so my nephew said, "So Thomas, what happened at Easter?" And Thomas very confidently just said, "At Easter, Jesus died on a hot cross bun." That was his understanding of what they had learnt at school that particular day. And what I want to do is I want to challenge this evening some of our assumptions that bring us here. I want to challenge some of the assumptions that we have already sung about. I'm a complete believer in everything that we have sung this evening, that Jesus died for me, that he died for us. But if we're not careful, we can come at the stories of Easter and just filter them through that conviction of faith. And what will happen is that we'll miss some of the nuance, some of the detail, some of the realities of what got Jesus crucified 2,000 years ago. And tonight we're going to look at one of the stories which I think is one of the most complicated to unpack, actually, of the life of Jesus, the cleaning of the clearing of the temple, sometimes called the cleansing of the temple. And you'll see that as we go on tonight, if we miss some of the nuance that was going on there, we would be able to worship Jesus actually ignoring some of the things that he was actually doing. So without further ado, and hopefully not making the mistakes of my nephew's son Thomas, let's look at the passage we're going to take a look at tonight. Allow me to read Mark 11. You might like to follow it with you. I'm going to be reading from the NIV. And it's not that I've memorized it, but it's on the screen up there. Jesus entered Jerusalem and went into the temple courts. He looked around at everything, but since it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. So we're locating ourselves on Palm Sunday in verse 11 in the evening. The next day, the Monday, as they were leaving Bethany, Jesus was hungry. And seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to find out if it had any fruit. And when he reached it, he found nothing but leaves, because it was not the season for figs. Then he said to the tree, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And the disciples heard him say it. On reaching Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple courts and began driving out those who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves, and he would not allow anyone to carry merchandise throughout the temple courts. And as he taught them, he said, "Is it not written, 'My house will be called a house of prayer for all nations'? But you've made it a den of robbers." The chief priests and the teachers of the law heard this and began looking for a way to kill him, for they feared him, because the whole crowd was amazed at his teaching. And when evening came, Jesus and his disciples went out of the city. And in the morning, as they went along, they saw the fig tree withered from the roots. And Peter remembered and said to Jesus, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree you cursed has withered." Mark chapter 11, the first day of the final week, the Monday of that first Passion, that first Easter Sunday. So, I wonder if we can go to the next slide. How are we to understand this story? What's going on in the cleansing or the clearing of the temple as we know it? Let's go to the next slide. Because you see, I think there are 6 bits of the jigsaw that we need to put together before we can appropriate this personally this evening. That first Palm Sunday, Jesus deliberately links what's going on Palm Sunday with what happens on Monday with that verse, Mark chapter 11, verse 11. Jesus entered Jerusalem, went into the temple courts. He looked around at everything, but since it was already late, he then left the temple and went back the following day, and that's when these events occur. In other words, Mark is saying that we can't really understand the clearing of the temple without understanding actually what was going on Palm Sunday as well. And so the first bit of the jigsaw is to understand Palm Sunday. And the most important thing to know about Palm Sunday is that there wasn't one procession into Jerusalem, there was 2. The first one was from the west of the city, where Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea and Samaria, would have come in at the head of a large group of imperial cavalry and foot soldiers. He came because the Jews were difficult to rule over at the best of times, let alone at Passover. At Passover, they were a genuine threat for 2 reasons. Number one, the sheer numbers of Jews who came on pilgrimage to Jerusalem during Passover. Caiaphas said he was a Jewish historian, says there were 2 million. That's probably a gross exaggeration. But the normal population of Jerusalem would have been about 40,000, and they reckon that at least 250,000 people came in addition to Jerusalem for Passover. So there were just numbers of these unruly Jews for the Romans to govern. But the other thing was what was Passover all about? Passover was the celebrating of the history that the Jews had previously seen off another oppressive empire, the Egyptians. That's what the Exodus was all about. And so you'd have 250,000 Jews celebrating the overthrow of previous empires' domination of Israel. And so the Romans came in power. The Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, would come with all his troops to reinforce the normal garrison that was in Jerusalem already, that literally overlooked the temple. And basically the Romans were saying to the Jews, don't even think about it. Don't you dare. It was intimidatory. But the second procession coming into Jerusalem that week was, of course, Jesus. Jesus was coming from the east, down from the Mount of Olives. Pontius Pilate was coming from the west, from Caesarea by the sea, where he had his palace. Jesus was coming in from the east, down the Mount of Olives. 100 miles it has been from Galilee to Jerusalem. And Jesus arrives not at the head of a great kind of army. He arrives very deliberately on a donkey. Mark's gone into great detail about the lengths that Jesus went to ride in on a donkey. It's hardly intimidatory, is it? But in Zechariah 9, the Old Testament prophet had said that the King of the Jews would come on riding on a donkey. And so this is Jesus very deliberately claiming to be the King of the Jews, but the king of a very different order to the way the Romans went about it. And so one was an imperial, majestic, powerful entrance into Jerusalem, and one was a peasant procession. One proclaimed the power of the Roman Empire, and the other procession proclaimed the kingdom of God, which was of a very different nature. And that sets the scene for what's happening in the cleansing of the temple. And then the second piece of the jigsaw is Jerusalem. Architecturally, Jerusalem was amazing. Even non-Jewish writers said that Jerusalem had the best temple in the entire Roman Empire. Herod the Great, or Herod the Monstrous, as the Jews called him, because he was so cruel, had done amazing things to the temple. They had built a platform on which the temple could be extended during the reign of Herod the Great, and it was 40 acres in size, an artificially made 40-acre site on which this temple was being built and extended. It was an incredible place. Herod's palace was amazing. It was a huge capital. But more than that, theologically, Jewish writers actually called Jerusalem the umbilical cord of the world, the navel of the world, if you like. The idea was that as God's chosen people, Jerusalem and the temple was the place where God touched earth. It was literally the place, Jews believed, where the earth gained its life and energy because God connected with Jerusalem. And so the writers called Jerusalem the umbilical cord of the earth. But the Old Testament prophets were by no means always complimentary about Jerusalem. Listen to what Micah, just one example of the prophet, says about Jerusalem. He said in Micah 3, "Hear this, you leaders of Jacob, you rulers of Israel, who despise justice and distort all that is right, who build Zion with bloodshed and Jerusalem with wickedness. Her leaders judge for a bribe, her priests teach for a price, and her prophets tell fortunes for money. Therefore, because of you, Zion will be plowed like a field, and Jerusalem will become like a heap of rubble." That's pretty bleak, isn't it? And what you have in Jerusalem is is a kind of encapsulation of the contradiction that runs throughout the people of Israel, that they are, on the one hand, God's chosen people, but on the other hand, they are deeply rebellious and have had God's judgment proclaimed on them. And Jesus himself was both positive and negative about Jerusalem. He used to talk about Jerusalem as the city that killed the prophets, but he would also weep over it. And so you've got this whole thing of, you've got these two processions on Palm Sunday and Easter Monday coming into Jerusalem. On Palm Sunday coming in from different points. You've got Jerusalem, the good, bad, and the ugly. The third part of the jigsaw, if we're to understand what was happening on that first clearing of the temple, is this idea of the politics of occupation. And basically, to cut a long story short, when King Herod the Great took over, two things happened in Israel which changed everything forever. First of all, economically, in order to raise more money, Herod got round all sorts of Old Testament laws, and he basically created a wealthy landed gentry. He basically took hold and possession of lots of land, and you suddenly had people displaced. It wasn't supposed to happen. The Old Testament said you couldn't sell land. But King Herod said, well, actually, the king can claim land. That's not the same as selling land. And so you had this wealthy landowning class that developed. And it was a great way for Herod to make money, because they did the tax collecting, and they also gave Herod bribes, and he allocated them land, and so it created more and more in the tax system. That was the first thing that happened economically. But secondly, what happened was that the high priest became a politicized role. A high priest was supposed to be appointed for life. You couldn't change them. But I think King Herod had something like 8 during his reign, and he just dismissed them as soon as they did something that he didn't like. And so you had this politicized high priest, and you had this economic kind of landed gentry, the kind of things that just weren't supposed to happen in Israel. If you think about the Highland clearances and Russian oligarchs, you'll understand something about what was happening when Herod was king in Israel. And by the time of Jesus, although they were now being ruled by a Roman governor, you still had that. You had a highly political high priest, and you had a highly disproportionate allocation of wealth amongst the priestly families, amongst the elite. And Israel just started to go very badly wrong. And so what was supposed to be the temple for worship actually became collaborators in the Roman oppression. Do you know where they kept all the debts, all the records of the debts of the Jews to Roman taxes? They kept them in the temple. And so a place that was designed for the worship of God, that was supposed to be the umbilical cord to the world, had actually become politically and economically very corrupt. In fact, when the Jews eventually did revolt against the Romans, the first 2 things they did was that they deposed the high priest because he was a political appointment, and the second thing they did was they burnt all the records of their taxes. And so what's going on there is this place that was supposed to be for worship. And if you think about it, Jewish theology said God is present in the temple. And sacrifices can only be made in the temple, which means the only place you can go to be forgiven is the temple. Can you see why pilgrims came from so far so often? Because that's where God was. And that's the only place where forgiveness was possible. And yet it got then caught up in collaboration with the Roman Empire, both politically and economically, and it just became so kind of mixed and messed. The fourth part of the jigsaw is the story that Jesus tells of the fig tree. What a bizarre story. Passover happened in the month of Nisan. That's not a make of a car, by the way. That's a month in the Jewish calendar. And there weren't supposed to be any olives on a fig tree. Olives on a fig tree? Let's try figs on a fig tree. There weren't supposed to be any figs on a fig tree in Nisan. It was not ready yet. There were just the leaves. And yet, in what appears to be a kind of strop, Jesus curses the fig tree, and by the end of the story, the fig tree has died and withered. Actually, what happens, and you can see it in the text that we read, it seems to be that the fig tree was both a symbol in the Old Testament of the nation of Israel, and here was this fig tree in leaf. It looked like it was healthy, but in fact it was bearing no fruit. And it was a prophetic picture of the place that Israel, Jerusalem, and the temple had got to. It looked healthy enough. The temple was grand enough, but it wasn't doing what God had made it to do. And Mark makes it very clear that we're supposed to understand the story of Jesus clearing the temple in the context of clearing the fig tree. And I'll come back to that in a moment. The fifth part of the jigsaw is Caiaphas, the new high priest, who, by the way, was the most successful by a long way. He survived 18 years in this delicate balance of trying to appease the Romans and not annoy the Jews too much, and this political compromise and getting wealth to Rome and to themselves. Caiaphas was very good at that, and he survived a long time. But it turns out that there is absolutely no evidence before this year, AD 30, that there had ever been a market actually in the court of the Gentiles in that temple. Up until then, the Sanhedrin had marketplaces for temple pilgrims up outside of the temple. And it looks like Caiaphas has set this up, and people speculate as to what reason, but there was probably money behind it. You see, if you were a pilgrim going to the temple, you needed the right change of money to give in the temple offering. You needed, if you were going to provide a sacrifice that was of the right standard, you needed, if you were walking 100 miles from Galilee, you needed to buy those animals, those doves and whatever, there in the temple. There is no hint that they were doing anything immoral. There is no hint that they were doing anything that was kind of manipulative or abusive. They were providing a service for worshippers. What Caiaphas has done is move that into the temple itself. And we'll come back to that in a moment as well, because it was happening in the court of the Gentiles. And then the last part of the jigsaw, if we're to understand what happened on that first week of Easter, the clearing of the temple, is what the Old Testament prophets were always talking about. Do you remember that verse from Amos? Away with the noise of your songs, but let justice roll down like water and righteousness like a never-ending stream. The headline of the Old Testament prophets was, people of God, you can never allow your worship to become a substitute for justice. You must always, always remember that divine justice and divine worship go together. And Jesus quotes in the story of the clearing of the temple from Jeremiah 7. And Jeremiah 7 is all about confronting those who come to the temple and ignore justice. And Jeremiah said, will you steal and murder and commit adultery and perjury and burn incense to Baal and follow other gods you have not known? And you've made this place a den of robbers. Now, of course, a den is not where robbers do their stealing. It's where they go to hide. And Jeremiah was saying, you are so unjust to your people. And then you come to hide at the temple as if singing your songs makes it okay. Worship can never be a substitute for justice. And so all of those things are in the background when we come to the clearing of the temple. Let's go to the next slide. So what happens? Jesus has sussed this out the night before. He's thought about it. He comes back on the morning of the Monday and he drives out the buyers and the sellers from the courts of the Gentiles. He overturns the tables of the money changers. He overturns the seats of the dove sellers. And Jesus wouldn't allow people to carry anything through the temple. And if we go to the next slide, what does he say? He quotes from two Old Testament prophets. He quotes from Isaiah. He said, is it not written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of robbers, quoting Jeremiah 7. Okay, that's all the background. Let's cut through to the chase and say, okay, so what was actually happening when Jesus cleared the temple on this Monday, that first Easter? Next slide. What does it show us about the Jesus we come to worship this week in Holy Week? What light does it throw on our understanding of the cross? Here we go. Number one, the first thing that I think the clearing of the temple reminds us of is that for God so loved the world that he gave us his son. In verse 17, Jesus explicitly quotes Isaiah 56 and says that this temple was supposed to be a house of prayer for all nations. Jesus cared about the whole world. And Caiaphas' changes to the temple market practice had effectively squeezed out the only place that Gentiles could go in the temple, the court of the Gentiles. He turned it into a marketplace. And so the Gentiles were effectively squeezed out, crowded out. All the way through the Gospels, in that last week of Jesus, Gentiles have an interesting place. Do you remember in John's Gospel where there were men who were Greeks came wanting to meet with Jesus in his final week? Who was the first person to declare that Jesus was the Son of God? It was the Roman centurion, a Gentile. And here is Jesus driving out the temple market because they are getting in the way, symbolically and prophetically, of Gentiles coming to Jesus. So at one level, Jesus clearing the temple is all about so God so loved the world that he sent Jesus. This gospel is for the whole world. The second thing that's going on here, because there's layers of meaning, this is the judgment of this domination system, this oppression. You have made it a den of robbers. That's what he's saying, quoting Jeremiah. Again, a den is not where the crime is committed, but where the robbers hide. So Jesus is not suggesting that the traders are corrupt individually. They could have been very moral people. They were providing a service for pilgrims. It's the part they played in this domination system. Worship had once again become a substitute for justice, with all these wealthy elites and this impoverished poor. When worship substitutes for justice, the temple is shut down. That's what the Old Testament prophets had said. And now a whole peasant class were being oppressed economically. The third thing that's going on here is this is God's judgment on their collaboration with the Roman Empire. The ambiguity around this high priest who was on the one hand the one who went into the Holy of Holies on Passover festival and at the same time was reaching in all the taxes for the Romans. The blurring the lines between the spiritual and economic and political authority of the day. The fourth, and this is the point of the fig tree, please don't ever call this again the cleansing of the temple or the clearing of the temple. The story of the fig tree makes it very clear. The temple is no longer the umbilical call for the world. This is Jesus prophetically and pictorially shutting it down. This is not the cleansing of the temple, it's the last rites of the temple. Jesus is the once and forever Passover sacrifice. He is the great high priest. He is the new temple, and this temple is stopping here. That's what's going on in the clearing of the temple. It's its last rites. And then it's also the fulfillment of Malachi chapter 3, which says, "Then suddenly the Lord you are seeking will come to his temple. The messenger of the covenant whom you desire will come. But who can endure the day of his coming?" So let's go to the next slide. So at the end of tonight, the first session of this Holy Week, we come to reflect on, so what does this mean for you and me? Two powerful prophetic actions rooted in the Old Testament. Sunday, Jesus entering the city, Monday entering the temple. Both pre-planned, both fulfilling the Old Testament. Two stories clearly meant to go together. Jesus pronouncing judgment on worship that is a substitute for justice. A judgment on an oppressive economic system legitimized in the name of God. A judgment on a politically and economically compromised temple. And paving the way for his once and for all sacrifice for the sin of the world. That's what made the Jewish leaders plot to kill him. And that's why I said at the start, there's a danger of us interpreting this story in a way which misses some of the things Jesus was doing. If we just jump to the idea that, oh yeah, Jesus was doing away with the temple once and for all because he's the new temple by which we come to God, that's true, but we miss some of the nuances. We miss the times when our worship is a substitute for justice. We miss the times when, with all the best intentions in the world, you and I get caught up in the dominating systems and the oppressive ways of economics in our world today, where we fail to see how the church can still be diluted in its spiritual authority because of its political and economic compromises. All of the things that Jesus was challenging in the temple are clear and present dangers to you and me as well. That's part of what was going on there. But where we finish this evening is this idea that we've been singing about tonight. Tonight, on this first night of Holy Week, here is Jesus, symbolically and prophetically, getting out of the way everything that stood in my way and your way. Here is Jesus clearing the court of the Gentiles so that the Gentiles could come to God. Prophetically, pictorially, symbolically, that's what's going on there. In that act, he is foreshadowing what he is about to do on the cross, effectively signing his own death warrant. Such is his love for you and me. He's pronouncing God's judgment, and then he's going to pay the price of that judgment himself, so that nothing need get in the way of you and me coming to God. That's what he's doing in the cleansing of the temple, as he makes a way for us. Let's pray. And so, Jesus, on this first night of this Holy Week, we stand in awe. We stand in awe of your immense courage, your phenomenal wisdom, your incredible self-control, and your total resolve to do whatever it takes to see the world won back for your Father. We worship you and we delight in you. Lord, this week help us to journey with you in your last week, that we might know you more clearly, love you more dearly, and follow you more nearly. Thank you that you have made a way for us.